Hello and welcome everyone. It is about 3 o'clock. We will give everyone a few minutes to get logged in, but just a couple reminders that for attendees, your microphones have been muted and videos are turned off. Please use the Q&A function to ask any questions. And if we don't get to your question today live, we will follow up with an email after today's presentation. There are no CEUs for today's webinar or for any of this series. And following this presentation, you will receive a PDF of today's presentation and a link to the recording. And you can also find previous recordings on our website, and I will make sure that you get the link to that as well. So, and then we also have the 2 more sessions in this series coming up next week, setting up your arrangements and arrangement oversight. So I will now turn it over to Laura.
Well, thank you and welcome. This is Building a Budget, presented by me, Laura Demuse, the Self-Determination Analyst for the department, and Marie Eagle from the ARC of Michigan. We're hoping to give you a pretty good overview and some detailed guidance around early planning and building that budget. Last time we talked about person-centered planning kind of as the foundation of all of this and building that budget throughout. And so this is the second session that continues that process. So as you can see, we did that person-centered planning piece. Now we're on building a budget. Next time we'll kind of go through the ins and outs of setting up that arrangement overall, and finally the implementation and the oversight and responsibility of all parties involved. So in this presentation, we're going to learn the basics of that budget development, dispel some myths, understand what the difference between rates and wages are, what budget or authority is, and budget oversight. So some things to think about. Self-directed services are all about control, and understanding who that control is with is really important. So in a direct hire arrangement, the employees are not contracted CMH employees, so they're not treated the same way as a contracted provider would be treated. They do not necessarily need to meet some of the same requirements as those CMH contracted employees. The employer is the beneficiary, and they really have that control over, managing and hiring, firing, disciplining, etc., those employees. So keeping that in mind, that this is a completely different model of service delivery, and to try and kind of put a different hat on while you think about this. The budget and the employees are also not CMH managed. So once that budget goes into effect, really that considerations for that budget are really in the hands of that beneficiary, and with they can work on that with their FMS. So the CMH really needs to be cognizant of kind of what's going in there and what they agree to in that budget, because after it kind of goes in to be implemented, it should be implemented as planned, and kind of outside of the control of being nitpicked by that CMH. Self-directed services, by the nature of choosing to self-direct, once the plan of service is written and signed and agreed to, medical necessity, amount, scope, duration, etc. Medical necessity has already been determined in that plan of service, but once it's the dollars and the services are in that budget, the control over that is really with the individual. So they get to choose kind of who's coming in their house, where their services will be, how much service, etc. That's the very definition of self-directed services. And for the CMH to understand that anything that they're worried about for risk should really be talked about before the arrangement starts. So any concerns or issues about worrying if the person is going to go over their budget, or hire the right people, things like that, that those things are dealt with before that arrangement starts and not during or after. It's all about prevention. So why do we have a budget? So the budget really, once the budget goes into effect, we're transferring, that traditional model and those services into dollars. So that control of funding really goes to the person, and that it's really outlining for the FMS, or financial management service provider, formerly known as fiscal intermediary. It's providing a roadmap for them to understand what's coming up for payments, what can and can't be done. So really a guidance for both of those parties to understand what it is that this person's trying to achieve through their plan of service and how those dollars are going to support that. And so we have a variety of models of self-direction that could be in the budget. Purchase of service is a way that you can contract with a professional that isn't already in the provider network for that CMH. So if somebody had a desire to maybe hire an occupational therapist or a psychologist or somebody that's going to be able to tailor their services directly to that individual in a way that they wouldn't be able to get in a traditional model, that's something they could do with a purchase of service. In purchase of service agreements, unlike a direct hire, that professional needs to be able to take the Medicaid rate, whatever that is for that CMH. In those arrangements, the beneficiary does not get to set their wage. So it's really important for the person to understand, if they're hiring them, they need to accept that rate. It's nice if they don't have if they're working for another agency, for example, there's not a non-compete clause or something that's going to prevent them from contracting with this individual, and that they can generally be able to work the hours and have all of those requirements met. That indirect.
I'd add that you would also want to use this model if you wanted to contract with a non-paneled agency, right? So not necessarily only an individual provider, but also maybe a provider agency who isn't paneled with the community mental health. And the same rules would apply for the rate within those arrangements.
Correct. Yep. And then the direct employment, where a person would hire typically those aid level staff, they are able to determine that wage, and that comes out of the budget and is determined by those overall rates that provide the top of the budget. So, a bunch of rules around budget development. The PHP and CMH must establish a transparent process for budget development. There should be an education about how the budget is developed and how it works. It is supposed to be wide and really tailored to whatever that person is trying to achieve. There's almost all services can be self-directed. We don't do, environmental modifications, specialized equipment, things that are already covered by Medicaid, like your straight Medicaid plan, obviously. Financial management services are all things that can't be self-directed, but if there are things that people do want to self-direct, there's a good chance that they can be able to do that. So be able to help people think of creative ways that they could self-direct services more than just their CLS. In the budget, it really includes all the services that person is choosing to self-direct. So a person can have a mix of self-directed services and traditional services, but the only ones that are going to count towards their budget are the ones that they're choosing to self-direct. And the cost of the FMS is, included, but it doesn't reduce the amount of available in that budget. So we want to make sure that any cost for administrative activities like background checks, etc., is not reducing the available funding for services. And, that there's enough money that is included so that the different taxes and employment insurance, workman's comp, etc., can be paid for inside of that budget.
We get that question frequently when it comes to what costs are reflected how. And so it's just, we want to be clear that the cost for the FMS should be reflected in the budget. It's not something that the person can control because that's a contract directly with your CMHSP, but it needs to be reflected as part of that arrangement. And so the other costs that we talk about here, like the taxes and your employment insurance, et cetera, do need to be included in the cost of that service. So they will reduce and take away from the available funds for pay rates, et cetera. So that's the difference between those two.
Yeah, and whatever, however much the budget ends up being, it must be realistic to accomplish the goals in the plan. So sometimes there's it is true that typically self-directed services cost less than a traditional model, but people got, they kind of shortcutted that, right? And instead of using the person-centered planning process and the values and philosophy of self-direction, they just looked at it as this is a means to cut cost and put some alternative rates, I suppose, into making these self-directed arrangements. So basically putting that cost first instead of looking at it as being realistic to accomplish the goals in the IPOS. So you want to make sure that whatever rates you're using for that budget is going to be enough to support that person to be able to do what they're trying to do. Again, we've said many times and probably many more times that this is, budget development is happening through the person-centered planning process. You want to have, people there that really understand how this works. So many CMHs have a SD coordinator. And, if you have those opportunities to meet with the FMS in person, those are always great opportunities, but you want to have enough meetings so that everybody feels like the discussion has happened about how to make this spending plan of the budget work and make the person-centered planning process, whatever those goals and objectives of that planning process are, making sure that that's actually going to be described in enough detail that everybody kind of knows where we're going and what is how the budget is going to be spent and what is going to be accomplished.
Yeah, and I think that it's really critical for folks to understand that piece of this. And that's what we see that's missing often when we go in and talk to folks who are utilizing these arrangements, is that we talked about a little bit in the last webinar, that information and assistance and ensuring that the person who is choosing that, one, they're choosing a self-directed arrangement and that they are fully engaged and understanding of what parameters the budget has, what control they have over items within the budget, along with that responsibility piece. And that is missing. We often talk to folks about their budget and they're not even aware of what is in the budget, or they're told that, well, no, we don't have a budget. We're just told what we can pay people. And so we really want to stress the importance of using that person-centered planning process to completely involve the person and their support system that they choose in the budget development. And I think that if we did a little bit stronger job in this area, then we would mitigate some of the problems that we see down the road, because people just aren't as aware of the expectations, roles, and responsibilities and control that they do have within this process, and where all of those maybe stress points or expectations lie.
For sure. So when you're developing that budget, the first piece that you want is what we call the estimated cost of service. This is almost always at the bottom of the person-centered plan when it's finished. So you're really taking the rates that are approved by your CMH for whatever services the person is self-directing, and totaling whatever that is, the cost of the units, in a summation, so that you get kind of the top of the budget. So that estimated cost of service is all of the services in that plan. And you're using that as a tool to inform this budget process. So not only should the person understand that total sum of all the services they are choosing to self-direct, but they should understand the total sum of all the services they're receiving, so that in the future, if they ever want to flex some of those services so that they have maybe a little more room in their budget, or for whatever reason they do decide they want more control over that specific service, that they understand that they have that ability. So we want to make sure that estimated cost of services is regularly being reviewed, actually, whether or not a person is self-directing their services, so that they can, really understand. Some CMH call this a explanation of benefits, but the point is to just make sure that people are aware of what's going on. So
yeah, and I want to stress that that really touches on the self-determination versus formal self-directed services, right? This has been a requirement for a really long time, that everyone receiving services receives this estimated cost of service, and you have a discussion with the person about how their funds are being used and whether or not they think there's good value for what they're receiving and helping them meet their goals, regardless of whether or not they're choosing to self-direct their services. And so this is, again, a crucial conversation that really needs to be tied to that person-centered planning process throughout the year, so that people are really making informed choices for whether or not they are getting value out of the funds that we're spending on their services.
Yep. And then the budget calculator obviously is going to help calculate the max of that budget, which we'll show you some good examples of that later. And then the monthly budget report, as services are going on, is going to be key to making sure that some people are staying within their budgets, that things are going well, and really kind of, again, stay in that proactive phase where you're being able to catch things before they get kind of out of control. So, like I had said, you're taking the cost of each of the line items by the units, by times the cost of the unit, and that's really the basis of how that budget is formed. Typically, a line item is associated with a service, and this is so that the budget can be billed properly, and then dollars allotted in that IPOS to a specific service. They don't need to match exactly that service in the plan. So there's a lot of things that are included in services generally in Medicaid that a person might find important for their arrangement. So for example, if there's training needs that somebody has, even if they're the required trainings or they're above the required trainings, that is something that there's not necessarily a code for per se, but they're going to be able to use that training as a line item in their budget and get it paid for through a different code. So right now, the people develop their budget either with their FMS or with the CMH. We really want to make sure that people are supported to develop their budget, again, through that person-centered planning process. And they really should have whoever it is on their person-centered planning team who's supporting them to develop that budget, and really looking at that as a team sport as to who is helping them in that primary role, and then making sure that the CMH is in agreement with that final plan. I talked about last time about like really trying to help the person kind of get to yes. So whatever it is that they're trying to achieve, figuring out like how that would be paid for, how that fits into the budget. That's kind of the creative model, and trying to figure out how to make that happen for them and what can and can't be done as part of that process.
And hopefully through that process, before you get to this, we'll say final meeting to develop the budget, you've had those creative discussions related to the goals and the plan and how maybe these dollars can be flexed a little more creatively to help meet those person's goals instead of just looking at, okay, here's your CLS, here's your respite, here's your supported employment, whatever that looks like. And like Laura said, we'll look at a couple of examples later. And I just wanted, like, neither of these practices are better or worse, like the FMS creating the budget with the person or someone from the community mental health, as long as that person is knowledgeable and the budget is being created with the person, not created and then presented to the person later.
Yeah. And I think, Marie just used some terms that, here's your respite, here's your CLS, right? That's very, very much a traditional model standpoint, right? Here's your services, we'll see you in a couple months or whatever. So we really want to look at it as we're changing services into dollars that the person's able to use to purchase whatever it is that they think is going to help them meet the goals of their plan. So that's kind of, again, how you put that alternative model hat on. So if you're choosing to have the FMS assist with the budget development, that CMH is going to provide the numbers for the max budget rate to the CMS or the FMS. Apologize. So that's based on whatever those current rates are. The FMS is going to be able to create budgets with specifics with the individual. So they're going to work with them about, talking about wages, et cetera, again, because the CMH should be removed from that conversation about wages as to not be seen as a joint employer, which is really important. So you want to make sure that the FMS has enough information to know kind of where that wage range is and what that max budget is so that they can find out with the person what they can and can't afford with the dollars that they have to utilize. So this is, again, once that person-centered planning process is done and that plan has been created, and we want to make sure that that plan and budget are both signed and approved before the arrangement starts. So making sure that, again, that budget is going to be able to support the person to do whatever they need. So this should be, again, kind of a team sport to make sure that everything is going to work the way it's planned. And so then again, the CMH can assist with that budget development. So this can be typically either, case manager, support coordinator, or if you have that SD coordinator at your CMH, who, this is their main role. So they're really good at being able to assist with that budget.
Yeah, we would not recommend case management or a primary clinician as the best practice to do budget development with someone. We would certainly recommend someone who has the role of a self-determination coordinator. There's lots of specifics and knowledge that's needed that we wouldn't expect a clinician to have for this process.
And the case managers, they can help kind of with that spending and that creative way about, thinking about that budget. But yeah, the details of like what needs to go in the budget and how it's developed is really in that SD coordinator role. So definitely making sure that somebody in the CMH that has that knowledge is there to help. So again, this is happening during the person-centered planning process. You're going to be able to determine rates and benefits. So what this person can and can't afford based on their budget. So the SD coordinator in this case, they're not going to be able to tell the person the wage specifically, but to be able to support to give a range so that that person can choose. And this is, again, a good place where, especially when people are starting a new arrangement, you want to help them understand when you're choosing that wage, if you're kind of maxing out the wage right away, you have no room for raises or bonuses or anything like that. And if you, in this era of high turnover, you don't want to be eating away at your budget, hiring somebody who only stays for, a couple weeks, and then having the cost of getting that person hired, and then have to hire somebody else, and you hired them at their very top wage, where you could have hired somebody that would have stayed and moved up to that wage. So just another part of education to make sure that people understand why it's not always the best idea to kind of pay at the very max right away.
That's not to say, though, that if someone receives that guidance throughout the budget process and still chooses to start someone at their highest wage, like, that is obviously up to that employer.
Right. Right. So, but making sure that they're informed that
Yes.
these are the pros and cons of being able to do that.
Yeah, that ties back into that transparent budget process, right? And that's why it's so imperative that you're sitting down, developing the budget with the person, because you can play with those. The budget templates, as we'll show a little bit later, are really straightforward to use, and so you can sit with someone and pull numbers in and out. Okay, well, what if I offer this, or what if I offer this? How would that affect this piece of the budget, or the pay rate, or the paid time off, or mileage? And so that really ensures that that person is completely involved in the creation of their budget and in the decisions that are being made.
Yeah. And ideally, you're trying to plan out as much as you can, in this process through the person setting and planning process, so that you're not having things mid-year, somebody decides, oh yeah, I forgot to put, I don't know, the raises in or whatever, because nobody told me, right? So you want to make sure that all of the things that you can think of that helps this person meet the goals of their plan are considered in their budget. So I think I got all that. I don't know. So I think this goes into what we were just talking about. So just making sure you're having real discussions with people. Again, we don't want people to just kind of be handed a document saying, this is your budget, figure it out from here. There are all kinds of things that can be included in that budget that are not typically thought of as, Medicaid services. So you want to talk about training. Training should be paid training. So labor law, like if a person is doing an activity because of work, they should be paid for it. So unless somebody is like, I just like to train for random jobs in their spare time, they need to be trained for that job. Mileage, paid time off could be in there. Just making sure, again, that you're giving a range and not saying your wage is X. And then any other benefit that the person might be able to afford and wants to be able to provide to that employee. So really the CMH is controlling kind of the top of the budget, and the person is controlling everything in the budget. So again, we talked about joint employment. So that's really why it's important to make sure that the CMH is only controlling the pieces that they can control. So we want to make sure that that range is included, that the person understands those employment taxes. Sometimes people kind of look at, like, I have this much money overall, and they're not quite understanding why they can't pay a certain rate, and they're not kind of subtracting all of the different taxes and workman's comp, et cetera, from that wage, because they're not regular employers, right? They probably haven't done this before. So making sure they kind of understand like where those dollars are going, and how that money is dispersed is really important to make sure that they understand what's going on with that. So making sure that you're having discussions with this person about all of the things that they possibly could do with their budget. And this is not an exhaustive list, but people should be able to pay their employees mileage. Again, we talked about training. If you're able to have staff attend meetings, they should be able to get that. Like maybe the maybe you're going to have like a group training at the house because there's something going on, you know, with the employees, and something's going sideways, so you want to have extra staff meetings. You could put holiday pay, paid time off. Overtime is especially important in this day and age, because even though the plan might not ever be to have any overtime because the person's planning on being staffed, things happen and services still need to be delivered. So being able to kind of think about if there is overtime, how does that affect the budget, and kind of pre-planning for that overtime instead of not planning for it at all and then not being able to use it if it's needed. That employer should be able to decide, they have to deal with the consequence of it, but that if they decide that they need to have overtime, then, you know, that should be allowed because that's the employer's role. So as long as there's still money in the budget that could cover that overtime, then that's fine. If there's an issue with, you know, the dollars that are left over, then that can be worked out with the FMS and the SC coordinator to figure out like how are we going to, you know, flex something to make this work. But again, pre-planning that stuff will really help avoid any problems and issues in the future. So again, cost of activities, possible bonuses, and then of course admin things like some people, they have to fax in all their timesheets, maybe they don't have a fax machine, you know, whatever it is that would be considered admin if you or I were running a business, those are things that could be also included in the budget and more.
So before we move on, Laura, we have a couple of questions. The first one is, who determines which trainings are required? Which is a great question.
So there's staff qualification trainings that are the same for all Medicaid providers. And I believe we have a slide. I know if there's one in the other presentation, if not this one. But your basic qualifications are about, you know, being 18 or older, being free from being able to prevent communicable diseases, being in good standing with the law, being able to communicate effectively, having knowledge of first aid, and being able to perform emergency procedures, and being able to do recipient rights. I don't have a being able to know what recipient rights are so that you can implement those. And then of course the person needs to be trained on the plan of service. So beyond those hard staff qualifications that every Medicaid provider needs, any training beyond that should really be up to the employer. There are a handful of required trainings that don't have anything to do with staff qualifications, but per the mental health code, for example, if a person is completely unable to take their own medication, for example, then staff need medication training, but that medication training doesn't have anything to do with staff qualifications. If that person decides not to take that training or something, then they can't pass meds. So those are kind of the things, the nuances, I guess, of that. And then trainings above and beyond. Sometimes, you know, maybe there's a family member who the child who's self-directing has autism or something, and they would like the staff to have some kind of training in what it is to have autism. That would be something that perhaps like could be above and beyond that staff qualification training.
Yeah, I always found it best practice to, as we're going through developing the arrangement, even before we get to the budget piece, making sure that that employer, family member, whoever it is, has the full list of available trainings so that you can go through that with them and see what trainings may be appropriate or not appropriate for their arrangement. And so we know, like, for full transparency, we know that there are community mental health around the state who are requiring training above and beyond the basic Medicaid requirements that Laura just talked about. And so while we do say in a lot of the language and documents that are out there in the guidance that best practice is that the CMH cannot require training outside of that, I think it would be probably more accurate to say that if a community mental health or a PIHP chooses to require training outside of the basic Medicaid requirements or the other specific trainings that Laura talked about, maybe related to the mental health code, that then they are putting themselves at risk for that co-joint employment status with the Department of Labor. So that's just a consideration that people really need to think about when it comes to these arrangements. And again, the employer is the employer. So just like any employer, they're the ones who are choosing outside of the requirements who, what their staff requirements are. And so we really need to come back to the spirit of that when we're talking about who can require things like trainings. So I hope that answered your question. If not, please feel free to ask another one. We do have another one, and it says, I've had guardians ask about adding vacation pay or holiday pay, but was told that it wasn't in the budget from the accounting department. Who determines how much money is in the budget? That's another really good question.
I guess my question is the accounting department from the CMH or the FMS? So I would rely on your FMS to decide, to understand the whole budget and whether or not there's enough money to do whatever it is that needs to be done. But if it's somebody at the CMH who's kind of deciding that, then that would be, again, you're kind of leaning into the joint employment rules.
It is CMH.
Okay.
In this instance.
So, and I think that's just something that, again, through that person-centered planning process, figuring out, if this is something that's really important to this person, like, how do we make that work? How do we make it so that the person can have that holiday pay and flex some of those hours, et cetera, so that can be afforded if that's something that's important to them.
Yeah, there's not really like the phrasing of that question. There's not like there isn't a line for holiday pay or pay time off or things like that in the budget. Isn't really a thing. It really is. They have the CMH can set that budget cap with their rate amount, not the pay rate, but their, service rate. And that is what sets the budget cap. So once that budget cap has been set at whatever that amount is, and we'll show you this in a little bit when we play with the budget live, what is included within that, whatever that cap amount is really up to the employer within the parameters of, how to meet the plan goals, etc. And so there's not like you can't have overtime, you can't have PTO. If it fits within the budget parameters and ensures that that person's needs are being met and those plan goals are being worked towards, then it should be allowed. We have another question related to EVV that asks about how will electronic visit verification, also known as EVV, impact an arrangement if the person does not have internet? Will it be required, and can this be included in the budget?
So I guess I'll answer it backwards, but internet, according to CMS, internet is not something that can be paid for with Medicaid dollars. And that, I believe, I've not specifically asked them, but I believe it's because that's considered a utility, and there are already a lot of programs out there for covering different utilities. There's some support around getting internet if you can't afford it, if you meet certain guidelines, which I believe one of them is if you already receive Medicaid, that you can get free or low cost internet. And then, even a cell phone, there's I don't even know what they call them now. It used to be the Obama phone and all kinds of things like that. So I believe that's why CMS won't cover those things at this point. But people that do not have internet would still need to use EVV. And what would happen is if there is no access to internet or cell service at the home, and there's no way to get those things, then there would be something called a fixed object device, which would be attached to the person's home, and it's just got a little code that comes up, and the provider would put in a code when they punch in and a code when they punch out to demonstrate that they were in the home with the person and able to provide those services. So, but really it's more on the providers typically for who is, I guess, the controller of whether or not there's internet or not. So a lot of providers typically have cell phones already, and there's a handful of FMS agencies right now for those who are self-directing that already have an EVV system. So some of you actually might be already familiar with kind of how that's working in those areas. But, you know, as we move forward, we'll probably try to work out some of those areas maybe that don't have that internet access and how we're going to provide that EVV service.
I think that's all the questions now. There have been a couple asking if there are specifics that we could reference from the Medicaid manual related to these requirements. And, you know, we reference them in both the technical requirement and the technical requirement guide, which we can link again we'll include it with a PDF when we send this out. But if you want more specifics about any of those source documentations, we have lots of references and helps on the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standard Act, which is the Department of Labor law that governs these types of arrangements, that we would also be more than happy to share with anyone who's interested.
Yeah, and really the authority for all things self-direction is really coming from our waiver language. So, and this is also in our ISPA now. So, you know, really covers all of the different HCBS waivers. So if you are looking for language that supports any of this, I would direct you to those and those policies and guides. So in the budget, the CMH has control over some things. So those training rates that we're talking about, as far as, you know, if somebody needs training for, again, like recipient rights, or they want something above and beyond, the employer wants a training above those requirements, they can establish what that rate is, that the person will be reimbursed for that training. They require their workman's comp. They will establish, again, that max amount of Medicaid funds that will be used in the budget, have a system for the oversight of that budget and make sure that everything is on the up and up. They should authorize the budget at the same time of the IPOS, so that things aren't getting misaligned. If you think about it, if the budget is happening at a different time frame than the plan of service, then the individual really doesn't have the same control over that budget, because then decisions are being made outside of that planning process. And so that individual isn't going to be able to make adjustments to their budget as needed. So we really want them to be matched up as far as how they're authorized and implemented. So, and then the other side note to this is that, you know, we want authorizations to kind of match that budget timeline and not be excessively rigid. The idea of being able to self-direct and have more freedom over and control over those services is really trying to allow people to use services at the frequency that they need them. So if you're doing like 3-month period authorizations, that can lead to problems where an individual isn't able to flex those services as much as they might like to, and maybe will lead to services not being used that, you know, should be used. So you want to make sure that those authorizations are long and robust, and, you know, unless there's something, you know, going on where you're worried about how the person is implementing the budget, and oversight is finding that they're in jeopardy of kind of going over, then those are some things that you can put in with agreement from the person as kind of guardrails to make sure that they kind of stay within their budget. But it shouldn't be across the board, everybody gets these 3-month authorizations, because that doesn't help a person have that flexibility they need.
Yeah, and we almost always see the use of those shorter authorization periods related to utilization management, right? Within these arrangements, there are budget reports that serve this purpose that already exist. And so, like Laura said, we'll often see, maybe, especially if it's a new arrangement, maybe within the parameters of the self-determination agreement, we write in language that talks about some more formal quarterly reviews of budget utilization and arrangement management with the person under that umbrella of providing support, information, and training to make sure that the arrangement is successful. But having a 3-month authorization is not the way to accomplish that goal.
For sure. And then the individual is, really in control of this budget. So they're deciding how much of the budget can be utilized at a given amount of time. So they might even have a plan to maybe purchase something or do something that, is going to use a lot of their budget, but then they'll use less of their budget the next month, for example. And that's okay, because that's what they plan to do with that budget in order to meet their goals. They determine when and how, pay wages. I like to use the term wages because it's confusing when you talk about rates. We'll say wages are changed. So again, deciding if somebody needs to get a raise, I don't know, or possibly a demotion. I don't hear that very much, but it might happen. Determining, any benefits that are included in the budget. Again, if overtime is going to be used, that it would be approved from that employer. Strongly encourage, the people supporting that individual to know, who to talk to if they don't know if they're, they have the money to use overtime. But, be able to plan for whatever emergencies they have is always best bet. And then they can move dollars from one line item to another budget line in order to serve their needs.
And when it comes to that overtime usage, that's something that we hear, concerns with a lot when it comes to overutilization of the budget. And I would say that most of the FMSs that we use in Michigan have overtime utilization reports that are available to both the person and the CMH, so that also allows you to monitor the usage of overtime costs and work with that employer to see how that is affecting their budget, so that we're not getting into, like we talked about earlier, we're working through issues or concerns as they come up, instead of waiting until the end of the budget year and then you're out of money or something like that. So utilizing the tools, which we do talk about a little bit today and in the follow-up webinars that exist to help manage these arrangements to make sure that they are successful, especially when it relates to things like overtime usage, delinquent training, which is not what we're talking about in this webinar, but things like that. Those reports exist. So I highly encourage using them.
You want to go on to the next slide?
Sure. Okay, so we get this question a lot, and it relates to how do you roll the cost of things that are not direct services into the cost of a service. So things like classes at a local gym or activity costs. And it really is pretty straightforward and basic. And we'll show you an example as we go in to the budget demonstration. But essentially, so if we have a service rate of $5 a unit, say, right? And you want to include the cost of a $300 class in there, you are just rolling that class into the cost of the service. So once you have a reportable direct service, if you're billing it as CLS, then you're reporting that CLS and you're spreading your FMS. Now your FMS is spreading the cost of that across those service costs. So it's all under that rate, typically. that has been approved in the budget. Now, sometimes, especially when it comes time to like pay for the workers' comp policy, since that comes up usually once a year, that rate might go over what that rate is in your budget when you're rolling something in, but you should be aware of that and be able to do some sort of like auth approval to go outside of that rate, because it's not going to go over the whole budget. It's just that we're paying like a higher amount right now for whatever that is, whatever it's an activity, it's a class, as long as it relates to the goals and isn't something that Medicaid doesn't allow, then we can roll that into the cost of the service. So something like that wouldn't be allowed right now with the rules that we have, which I'm hoping will be improved soon, would be something like I'm using community living supports only in my budget and in my plan to meet a health and wellness goal. And I want to go to a gym, but I don't need support from my community living support provider to go to this gym. So that cost would not, unless they're on the habilitative support waiver and they would want to call that goods and services, that wouldn't be able to be rolled into the cost of like a CLS service, because that has to be a direct right service that we can tie that to for a person or a staff person. So there are obviously like ways that you can't do it, but overall, as long as it meets the service code definition, which I think we talk about again in another slide, then that is how you build those things like training. We had a question a couple of weeks ago about how do you pay for training? There's not a specific code for training, or there's not a specific code for a PTO. And again, it doesn't need to be a code, because what you're doing is you're including that in the cost of the service that you are providing to the person. And so you're going to include the cost of your PTO or of your paid training, and you're not going to have a separate code. That's all going to be rolled in and covered under the CLS. And so when we talk about, people worry about, well, how do we justify that cost? It goes back to that golden thread that we talk about when we do the site reviews of, if we're working towards that goal in the plan, and the service activity, whatever this additional cost is that we're including in the budget, is being provided to help that person work towards those goals, then it is justified and it meets the medical need definition.
Yeah, and I think one way that you can kind of think about it is, when we pay an agency provider to do kind of the same thing, like Marie brought up training, pay time off, you're not coming back at them and saying, oh, you use Medicaid dollars to train your staff and give them paid time off. Like, that is something that Medicaid pays for. So trying not to get, so deep in the weeds that you're not kind of being able to pay people kind of basic things that would be a part of any job, because it's, not specifically in a Medicaid code directly that you know of. That's not really necessary. So if you think about that it's getting paid for somewhere else in Medicaid, it's allowable as well in these budgets.
Yeah, and it's going to be, we're not increasing the cost for these types of services, right? So you've already set your max rate, your max budget for whatever it is, and these costs are coming out of that max rate. So we'll get questions often about how do we pay for staff, or my staff aren't allowed to attend my planning meeting because there's not a code for it, or because it's considered double billing if they bill this at the same time, right? It's all the same thought, is that that staff should absolutely be part of that planning process if you want them to be there. And they're not billing CLS, they're billing it as like a zero, so they're zeroing it out when they're billing their timesheet, and it's that cost for their attendance is being rolled into the CLS that they provided either pre or post that meeting. So the same idea for all of these types of questions that we get related to this issue of rolling things into the cost of the service.
Yeah, so like Marie had already said, if the cost is going towards the goals of the plan and it meets the billing code definition, then it can be rolled in. So the main thing is that there's just some code that FMS can bill those costs to. So we want to make sure again that authorization period aligns with the plan of service, and once everything is approved, that individual can make those changes without CMH approval, again, because they're in control of that budget, and that budget needs to be able to go with them. So once it's signed, that individual does not need that approval to make changes within the framework of that approved budget. If they're going like way, way, way outside of what was planned, then yeah, we need to sit down and have a meeting. But generally, you know, that's going to kind of go along with them through their process. The flexibility of it, again, we're talking about having wide offs so that people can kind of use their budget as needed. And, you know, basically being able to change it throughout the year as needs change. I'm trying to remember what ideological versus currently available practices is, Marie.
So I think that question is one that we often get, that ties into, well, if we make a change to the budget, we don't also have to make a change to the plan. And that's not accurate, right? So, you know, if I will need an increase in my budget and I need more hours than are approved, or I'm going to move a line item from CLS to respite or vice versa, then it does also still need an accompanying plan change, authorization update, budget update to go with it. But that doesn't mean that it can't be done, right? So I think that right now, ideologically, we would love to be able to just have the person have their budget and be able to go forth and use it as they choose without having to follow up with those pieces. But that is still a requirement at this point. And I think that for, at least for me, like the flexibility piece, you know, I think that we really need to do a lot of work on, and it's again tied to taking off that traditional model thinking cap when it comes to implementation of these dollars. Like, instead of implementation of these services, it's implementation of these dollars that have been approved for people. So things like, especially right now, given the staffing shortage, right? Your medical necessity has been determined during your planning process. It's documented in the assessment. Your budget has been built on X amount of hours, but you're underutilizing the hours because you don't have the staffing. But boy, you'd be able to keep your staff easier if you could pay them a higher wage. So those dollars are approved and authorized. And so you should be able to do things like moving the dollars from, maybe you're not going to use as many hours because it doesn't fit with your life right now. You're still medically they're still medically necessary. Those funds are there, but the spirit of self-determination is then you can use those dollars to maybe pay your staff more than you would have been able to pay had you been using all of those hours, because those dollars are your dollars to meet your goals in the best way possible. So we really want to start working towards looking at flexibility in a way that you wouldn't typically think about.
Yeah, and everything is not like one-to-one once you've made this budget and turned it into those dollars. So in that example that Marie just said, because you're paying somebody more, you might use less CLS hours, for example. Well, that doesn't mean, some places think because you're using less services, then those less services will then reduce the amount of your budget. You're not changing the dollars that are in the budget. You're just changing, you know, you're using those dollars in a different way. You're purchasing something different in a different way. And that's kind of the difference.
Yeah, and again, we're not increasing what we're spending, right? So your budget's been approved, the money's there. So unless a need increases, that you would document within a self-due arrangement the same way you would document it within a quote unquote traditional arrangement, right? Using the assessment, using the plan. Unless a need increases that can be documented and shown, your budget isn't going to increase. And so really what we're talking about is using those already approved and agreed to dollars flexibly to meet the person's goals.
Yeah. We have these little asterisks at the bottom about following all policies and procedures. So those changes in the plan, grievance and appeals, etc. You know, like one of the things, if you were talking about that, like reducing the amount of services that would, you know, need an ABD. If this person puts this in writing that they want to reduce those services, then that you don't need to send an ABD for that, because that's part of the Medicaid manual, that if that person puts that they've decided to reduce services themselves, then you don't need to send out that ABD, for example.
You would want to document that, right, in your paperwork so that it's there. But so it's just understanding like the nuances and how you how you follow the rules to make sure that you're really providing flexibility to people and still meeting your requirements as an agency.
So we've been talking a lot about flexibility. So apparently it's very popular right now. But again, moving those supports around, using, more hours in one month than the other, just making sure that the person isn't exceeding their authorized budget amount and staying within that, those guidelines. And really that team of people that's supporting this individual are all kind of looking at those monthly budget reports, being in the know of kind of what's going on with that arrangement. So again, if there's something that's we're starting to look, a lot of the budget reports are green or yellow or red. So if we're going yellow or red, if something needs to happen to talk to that person, then that can happen before it's too late.
And when we say staying within your authorized hours, we're talking about the year, right? The budget time frame that aligns with the plan. We're not talking about the plan was built off of 10 hours a week. And we do hear this where maybe the FMS or the person has been directed to say, we're only approved for 10 hours a week, so we can only use 10 hours a week. That is not how self-directed arrangements work. They have that flexibility to use more or less, or plan for maybe a vacation later or something like that. So staying within the budget, again, it's imperative that we're talking about the budget. We're not talking about week to week. There has to be that flexibility so that hours can be used to that best meet the person and the family's needs.
Yep. And all of that again happens through, monitoring and oversight, really working in a collaboration. Again, like I said, trying to figure out kind of how to make things work instead of, kind of shutting people down right away. Making sure that the communication channels are open between all of these parties. Again, monitoring that budget report, and then, making sure that all the agreements are really working for the arrangement and making sure that they have the kind of guidelines in them that they need to have. And those are really your safeguards in making sure that the arrangement is going to be enacted in the way that you want it to. The CMH, that's really where kind of their control is. And if there are things that if limitations need to be put in, for example, and again, we'll get into that in some of the other presentations, but it really is your way, because that is your agreement that makes these arrangement work. So if something, again, is an issue, that somebody's worried about, there are parameters that you can put into those agreements that all parties agree to make sure that you're preventing issues before they arise.
We did get a question related to raises within the budget. So say a guardian employer wants to give a raise to an employee, can the community mental health say that is not in the budget? We've been told that there were no raises approved for providers other than mandated Medicaid raises.
So the CMH does not set the wage.
Yep.
So that any raise to wages would be, again, a communication between the employer and the FMS. The FMS is going to be able to tell you, the employer, if there is enough money in the budget to be able to afford to have that raise. And if there is enough money, that person should be informed of, if you give this raise, it might mean, we're getting really close to, getting to the top of your budget, or no, you have plenty of money if you want to make that raise. Typically, there's some kind of documentation that happens that shows the employer that they're going to do this raise, and then the FMS will implement after that documentation comes through. So no, I think, again, the CMH is saying you can't give your employees a raise. Again, you're kind of treading into that joint employer zone. So probably not the best idea.
I mean, there certainly will be times when your budget is at its max, and that needs to we want to be able to see a discussion, like we talked about earlier. It has to be realistic to meet the goals in the plan. And so if you have a budget that is maxed out and there is no room for raises, then you're not able to utilize or pay staff a living wage high enough to meet your goals and whatever that looks like. We would like to see a conversation happening, back at the person-centered planning level to talk about what could be done, because this budget is no longer meeting the needs. Like, did the needs change and increase and they weren't documented? Well, like whatever that looks like. But those situations certainly come up where this is your budget and it's at its max, your needs haven't changed, and you don't have the room to offer what it is you'd like to offer. And I want to say we did get a question, we're an acronym happy world. And so apologies, FMS stands for Fiscal Management Service, which was formerly and typically also often still known as FI, which is Fiscal Intermediary. So that is the accounting agency that assists with these arrangements.
Anything else?
Not right now.
All right. So the individual also has responsibility for monitoring that budget, making sure that everything, again, is running smoothly. So they need to make sure that they're, just like Marie just said, they're the example, right? That they're using their budget in a way that's going to meet the needs identified in the IPS. So if they blow their budget and then, like she said, there's not enough money left to pay people, then you're not meeting the needs of the plan, right? So being able to monitor and stay on top of that budget, make sure that you're within, what approximately was thought to be used in that month is a good way to stay on top of, what's being used and what you have left. Staying within those authorized amounts, again, to make sure that, you're not going to get in jeopardy of going over that budget, and, reviewing that report, and then, really making sure that the CMH and FMS knows of any needed changes to that budget, and then ensuring documentation is present for all Medicaid covered services. So I think we talked about this a little bit last time. However, that employer record would like to make sure that that documentation is happening. Documentation can stay with them. It can go with a case manager support coordinator, get scanned into the EMR. It just depends. It just needs to be available for any kind of audit or anything that the CMH needs, but the FMS should not be in charge of reading that or disseminating that documentation in any manner, as in a clinical capacity. So that's not their role. So just making sure that that's not happening, however that those documents are managed.
And when we say informing the CMH and FMS of changes needed, right, that could mean a couple of different things. That could mean that you're not just informing the CMH if you need a budget increase or you're moving from respite to CLS or something like that. Like, that's going to need a little bit more effort, like we talked about earlier. But if you're giving a raise to a staff and it's within the parameters of your budget, the CMH doesn't need to be informed of that. The FMS needs to be informed of that. And so that's why when we talked about setting up these arrangements, and we'll talk a lot more about it in next week's webinars, it's so important that the person knows what control they have over these dollars and who they need to inform of what, so that we are being responsible, both from the CMH standpoint and from the employer standpoint, to make sure that everyone is informed and that needs to know, so that problems that we see arise don't arise.
Yeah, so now getting kind of into the nitty-gritty stuff of the budget. So the first part is really talking about kind of how you figure out that max part of your budget. So for example, if you have the CMS provider rate at the CMH is $575 a unit, and this person's going to have 40 hours a week of CLS, they get $47,840 a year. Same for respite. You figure out the units and how much that yearly max is, and then supported employment. Again, $375 per unit is a total of $7,800 a year, which makes for a total of $56,240 a year that person can flex and use towards their goal. Again, you have to make sure that we're backing out like those taxes, workman's comp, mileage, any other benefits that the person wants to include. So that has to be taken into consideration with that budget as well. And so that will be kind of your first step to kind of coming up with that budget max. And then this is, kind of a very simple, straightforward budget, but you can see it's got its total cost, the authorization period, what it generally is including. You got, your CLS, mileage, paid training, paid time off and vacation, a class, and, kind of where the rate, the pay rate can be. So you have anywhere from minimum wage up to $16 an hour. This might be a little bit different than at the moment because we have all the wage pass-throughs. So minimum wage is not technically the 1010 that everybody else gets, but more like, I think it's 1405 or somewhere in there, with all the pass-through payments. So I don't think this includes that, but you want to make sure that that wage pass-through is kind of like the first money that's going to a person's wage, and then everything else is on top of that, because that pass-through is supposed to go directly to that employee. Unless that employee signs something that says, I do not want this money, do not give it to me. It absolutely has to go directly to that employee. And then there are some admin costs that go to the fiscal intermediary if when that's included. So to manage all of that. So, and then adding all of that up, it gets you your kind of total cost. And so you can see that there in this example, there's home help. So our total cost is higher, and then we take the home help out because the person's not technically self-directing that, but it is, definitely something that's usually associated, especially if you're going to have CLS. A lot of time people have home help as well. And so that's kind of generally how you develop that budget. And then this is kind of an example of how you can kind of set wages and kind of figure out what that max hourly rate is. And once this is developed, you can set that range and be able to help make that budget equitable so that employer record has enough funds to be able to pay their employee. And let's see. And I think I'm going to switch it over to Marie so she can kind of go into a deep dive of kind of that wage calculator and the budget. So,
All right, hopefully this works. Like, this is always a hit or miss with technology. So
yeah.
hoping, fingers crossed. So this is just what we're about to show you is just one of the current budget calculators that exist. It's the one that I have been most familiar with over my career. Bear with me for just a moment. But and really the purpose is what my hope is just to show you how really straightforward and basic this budget creation can be, so that while you're helping someone create a budget, it's really something that people can be engaged in. Yep. Let's see if this works. I'm gonna try this one. Is that showing, Laura?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So again, all of this is made up. None of these numbers are real. but this is a very straightforward budget template that I used to use, and I believe is still being used in the field right now. So ignore this first box, because this is what we would currently call our spending plan. And this will all get filled in once you have created the budget with the person. So as Laura talked about, we're going to start going backwards. So we have developed our services that are based on the plan, our amounts. We know what our unit rates are. So we know how much money we have to work with. So again, very basic, straightforward formulas. If this changed, like we don't, we're social workers, right? So we always like to say, like, I didn't go to school to know math. I don't know math. You don't have to know math, like when you use these calculators. Or again, often in places your FMS is the one that is doing this process, but this is the process that we would expect to see happening with someone. And this is the meaningful piece of it. So if it's not your CMH or it's not your self-D coordinator, it's your FMS doing this, but you're going through it together with the person. So these numbers, again, you're plugging in very basic numbers. CLS is a 15-minute unit. So, you're really basic multiplication out on what is 10 hours a week for the whole year, for whatever that time period is. For this budget, we just plugged in January 1st of next year through the end of the year. And that's going to give you, this one we have home help costs. So these are standard costs that the person can't control, right? The pay rate, et cetera, is already determined by the department, so that's not something that they have control over. So that's going, but it's going to be part of the service. So of the cost. So, but we remove it when we have our total amounts here. So whatever these services are that the person is going to be self-directing, we want to have the pay rate for the whole year, or not the pay rate, I apologize, the service rate, so that we know how much money we have to work with for the year. So then this becomes the amount of funding that is available for those services. So once you have your number here, you can go to one of our, you'll typically see it called an hourly rate calculator. And this is one of them. This is the one that Stuart's office uses. So this one doesn't show you all of the background calculations for things like your workers' comp and your employment taxes, et cetera. But it's all calculated there. So now you have 16,000 and some change to work with, and you just start plugging in your numbers, right? So if you're going to work 10 hours a week, what can I pay them? I want to pay them $25 an hour. Well, that's not going to work, right? Because we know we have to add in other things. So you just start playing. So you have workers' comp, right? So I like to say that you want to start. So even though you have like your 10 hours a week of CLS and your 4 hours of supported employment, you want to start with your standards. So you know that you have your standard costs, things like workers' compensation insurance. So workers' comp, you have to kind of guesstimate based on how many full-time and part-time employees you will have. That's not a standard number that you like have a certainty for at the beginning of the year. That is figured out, unfortunately, later, but you want to have the funding in there and you want to have it covered for your budget year. So you start saying, okay, I'm going to have potentially 2 part-time employees. So it starts taking that funding away and you're building up to your total budget, right? If we're through the planning process, realizing that, okay, our person is going to be doing a lot of driving, they're working on community socialization and activities. So we're going to, need 100 hours a week of mileage reimbursement, but that's also a conversation that you want to have. And so we're adding those dollars into this budget and working backwards. So now you see, well, 18,000 is over the 16,000 that we had available. So we need to play around with those numbers. So that's a conversation then that you have with the person while you're building that budget. Like, okay, well, that doesn't support 100 hours a week and $25 an hour. So, can we pay $22 an hour? And so you're really just moving these around. You're adding paid training hours here. So all of those costs related to this service and related to this staffing are included in this budget. And you're ensuring that they do not go over that highest budget rate that you had agreed to. And so this is the conversation where you have, that discussion about like, do you want to pay a higher wage or do you want to reimburse mileage, right? Like mileage, some people want to make more. They don't want to deal with mileage reimbursement because that has to be documented. Some people want mileage reimbursement for their staff because if you reimburse under the federal mileage rate, they don't have to claim it as taxes. So there's like all of those little nuanced pieces that you want to take into consideration as you're building this budget with people. You know, some CMHs pay the FMS to do the background check. If so, you're going to want to add some of those in here. And so we're guessing based on how many employees you think you're going to have, or if you know, then you want to have that number be specific if you know. But once you have all of this, and again, this is very bit, and this is CLS budget, it doesn't necessarily mean CLS, right? So if we have all of these services, hours, units, it's very straightforward to get to the number that you want with the vacation hours, holiday hours, training hours that work for that person and for what their needs are. And once you have developed all of this, then you have your spending plan. So once you're in agreement, it's within the authorized budget amount. You know, here's how many excuse me, here's how many miles we're going to approve. Here's how many training hours. Here's how many vacation hours at what rate. Say my CMH has set my training rate, and training rate means, right, like, again, the staff has to be paid for training that is required. So we're talking about training, like taking my recipient rights or my bloodborne pathogens class or whatever that required class is, or maybe some on-the-job training that they need to do with existing employees. So both of those things could be considered training hours. So we're going to put that training rate in, and we're going to make sure that all of that information then, when we go back to that front, is included here, right? So then when you have your budget, and this is the actual budget that's signed, you know what this budget includes. This one's going to include, again, it's all made up, but your 10 hours of CLS, your home help, your supported employment, your, I would change all of this to be whatever we ended up putting in there. If there's a training rate, I would always add like at training rate of $10 per hour, right? So the FMS knows, your employees know, the CMH knows exactly what is being approved at the time. And so if changes need to be made, then you can do that within this framework. If it's with outside, so that's what we say when we say within the framework of the approved budget. This is what I consider the framework of the approved budget, whatever ends up within this little box in my world. And so everybody has that to refer back to when they are adjusting the budget to meet their needs. This one happens to also cover the cost of a YMCA membership. And so that's what we talked about with the rolling in. The YMCA membership, we would just add a line here. Oh, that should be to the front of the budget. So that's going to also be part of this dollar amount, right? So that doesn't increase, but when we're doing this rate here, and we're trying to figure out what we can include in the budget, that cost is there so that it's already included. The cost for that additional membership, whatever activity, is already included in the rate that you're providing to your FMS. And so that is like a really basic crash course in budget development. And this is not the only budget calculator out there, but it's really straightforward. And then you can amend it as the year goes on. So say you do need more in March, or something happens that you need to make a big change, you're just building on this budget throughout the year. So you're not throwing it away. You're building on it, adding to it to meet the person's needs. And so then once you're done, this gets signed, this gets approved. A copy of this is sent to your FMS. It's sent to the CMH. The person has it. So everybody's on the same page. Stop sharing. And I know that was really fast and a crash course. And again, we'd be more than happy to answer additional questions or go into more specifics with people if they need. But it's really just, again, that's an easy way to sit down with someone and work through what they want included in the budget. And so I see a question about where the total dollar figure for the budget comes from. And so that comes from those rates that the CMH can set. So if their rate for community living support is, again, making this completely up, $5 a unit, and you're self-directing your community living supports at $10 or 10 hours per week, then you have the equivalent of $5 per unit at 10 hours a week that we showed in that budget for your budget. And so this slide that Laura has up now is a sample of one of the budget reports that we have right now in the state. And now these are expected to be sent out monthly. I think the current language is no later than, is it the 10th of the month following the month of service? I think that's it, 10th or the, so you should be receiving these. A lot of like GT has them on their portal. Most FMSs will say, or will ask who you want to receive this. Do you want to receive it? Do you want your guardian? Do you want your support broker to receive a copy? The CMH receives a copy. So that this is, and again, really straightforward, easy to use, color coded, most of them, so that you have a really clear snapshot of where you are with your hours, what has been approved. So if you had multiple services approved, this would have multiple lines for, say, community living supports, respite, employment, whatever those services look like, your time frame that it was authorized. This should all match up exactly with the budget. The time frame that the budget was authorized, what you've been authorized for, what you've used, what would be expected if you used it consistently, and then where you are over under. Now, a lot of these will also include the dollar amount. So in addition to the hours that you're using, over under, on track, then you would also see if you're over or under the rate that was approved. So that those are all tools that help you as you're trying to manage your budget. Or help the CMH if they're trying to support someone to manage the budget. Like if you see orange or if you see red when you're getting these reports as a CMH, you know you've got some sort of overutilization going on and you really need to start talking to this person about what's going on. They may be well aware that they're overutilizing right now because they're not going to use later, or vice versa. But that's a conversation that happens so that we're making sure that these are successful and we don't run up against an emergent, oh my gosh, I overused and I didn't realize it. At the end of the budget year, especially. That's messy.
And these are something we're talking with, people in FMSs about, these should be really easy to read for the person who's self-directing. So if you're finding that somebody is having a hard time interpreting this, see if you can work with the FMS to see if they can come up with something a little more tailored to that person, because it really is important that they kind of understand where they are in their budget. Like maybe for this is just units, so maybe for them they really like to know, they just want to see like a pie chart of all their dollars and what's been used and what hasn't been used, or whatever that is. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it always has to look like this. And I just realized that I think, is it all of our examples? Most of our examples are from Stuart Wilson.
They are.
Really say use it Stuart Wilson. It just happened. I apologize. So
well, and GT has their portal, which
yeah.
most of theirs are online and accessible. But I really think that, and we talk a lot more about the use of these reports and the oversight of these arrangements, but truly so many of the issues that we hear of are because we're not using these tools that exist, right? So if we're not actively reviewing these tools and engaging in those conversations with the person, then you are setting yourself up, your CMH and your employer, for the potential of issues related to, potential utilization, overusage, underusage, right? So because these arrangements have to have built-in flexibility, you really need to rely on these reports. And we had a question about having this emailed, the example that we use, and I would be more than happy to send that out. There is a question about what the max 15-minute unit rate for CLS under the children's waiver is.
Well, when it was fee for service, if I remember right, I think it was, I want to say it was like 650, but I don't know for sure. I might be making that up. Unfortunately, like there's the rate is still up to the CMHs now because children's waiver went to a capitation payment. So hopefully your CMH kind of stayed in line with what those fee for service rates were, because I am pretty sure the people who worked at the state worked really hard in the couple of years before it went to a capitation payment to get those rates increased. So it'd be nice to keep those, especially because children's waiver children, do need, some more intensive support than maybe people just, using the iSpot, for example. So really being able to keep that in mind and be able to utilize those rates as intended is probably best practice. So hopefully that sort of answered your question.
Yeah. We also had a question about knowing how much, if you have a surplus in funds. And yes, and I apologize, I didn't think to include the other version of this report, but the other version of this monthly report that shows the dollar amounts also would show then, so say your rate is $5 an hour or unit. I apologize, and you're only utilizing at $4 and something per unit. It would show you that percentage that you have banked, I suppose, that you could say. And typically the FMS also provides your CMH with a much more detailed report when it comes to utilization. So if you're looking for something even more detailed when it comes to the dollars, those are also available. But this is more the standard report that is simple, straightforward, and easy to understand.
And that's the end slide.
We
So
do have a question related to paying for staff activities or costs. So i.e. if we're going out to eat, can you include things like the staff's cost or the YMCA? When the YMCA, I will say that when it comes to that specific question about like, does it cover a pass for the staff as well? Typically any arrangement that I worked with that had like a gym membership or a YMCA membership, really all you had to do was talk to the YMCA or that gym, explain that that person had this support person that would be providing services with them, and that was, oh, we didn't need to pay for a pass for that staff. So if that answers that question, I don't, that doesn't address the going out to eat or going to activities piece. So I'm gonna toss it to you, Laura.
thank you. So meals are not a Medicaid covered item, I guess. I think again, if you put it on your head of like looking at typical employment, like when we come to work, whoever you work for is not paying for your lunch. You generally have to figure that out yourself. So the only exception might be is if you're having staff go with you on vacation, or maybe somewhere you're traveling somewhere where that staff does not have, just like if you went to a conference or something, maybe you can get those meals reimbursed, but that would need to be worked out ahead of time, figure out how that would work. But generally, like, if you're just taking the person out in the community to work on whatever CLS goal and they happen to eat during that would have to come out of the person's pocket for whatever meal they wanted to buy while they were there.
Thank you. And we did have can the family receive information about other fees included, like the pay to the fiscal and the caseworker? And the answer is absolutely yes. That cost of service that we talked about earlier, and we can give an example of what that looks like is required for every person who receives who receives services through the community mental health to receive at least once a year. And so that would include all of the services in the plan. So clinical services, whether it's case management, therapies, whatever they're receiving in the plan, it's going to include the cost for that service, the rate for the service, and then the annual amount. And again, the reason for that is because we want to make sure that the person and the family are making an informed decision about how their dollars are being spent and whether they feel like they're getting a good value for those dollars for the service that they're receiving, or if they want to use it differently. So while the budget will include a cost for the fiscal management service or fiscal intermediary, which you would see there, it's not something that you can control because that cost is negotiated between the community mental health and that fiscal, but you should be able to see it. And then the cost for all other services that you're not choosing to self-direct would be reflected in your cost of service report.
Yeah. And if you get a cost of service at the end of the plan and something looks not quite right, I would ask about it. Those things are generally automated. So once the authorizations get crunched and whatever, then the electronic health record does the calculations and puts all that in that estimated cost of service. So if you've got like numbers that don't make any sense, like that the person is receiving, like, I don't know, let's say they get 18 hours a day of CLS and the dollar amount is coming out to like, $300 for the year. Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So I would, just question it and see if you can get somebody to take it back and get it recalculated so that it's accurate, because sometimes those things just don't calculate it out for some reason. Something's weird in the coding or whatever. So it doesn't mean that somebody's trying to pull the wool over your eyes or anything, but just, not everything's perfect all the time. So
Yeah.
plus we want this to be more accurate, or at least I do personally. So so
Okay.
ask BPH to make them more accurate. It'll help.
Yeah. And then we have another question. So we talked about food and eating, but what about paying for staff movie or concert tickets?
It's technically a work cost, but these are the things that you need to kind of consider about, like, so you're going to a movie or concert. How does that meet the goals of your plan, and how does it relate to that CLS service? Like, what exactly is going on that meets kind of the Medicaid rules of whatever you're doing? So, both of those things I put kind of in the recreation column, which is not technically CLS. So you kind of got to be careful about, what is considered CLS and what isn't. I think this is a general training issue that's good for employers' records to understand, especially when they have both CLS and home help, for example, to understand what is CLS and what isn't, to understand what's home help and what isn't, so that they can make sure that they're kind of putting those things in the right category. So that does get a little bit weird. I would say generally, like, that's not something that you're gonna put in the line item unless there's some weird thing about the goals where somehow, and I can't think of how, I just don't want to like shut it down in case somebody's goals and like it really involves going to concert. I don't know, maybe this person like performs in the concerts, I don't know, and they need the support at the concerts. But generally, like, unless it's really completing the goals and objectives of the plans, that's not a cost that would be covered. Does that make sense? You're on mute.
Thanks.
Yep.
Sitting here talking away. And I do want to say that yes, this presentation will be available. We're recording it. A PDF of the PowerPoint will be sent to participants within hopefully a week, and then it will be linked to our website and our YouTube channel, where all of the other monthly PCP webinars are located for future viewing. And I'm not, we had a question, and I'm not 100% certain I understand it, related to including details about a CMH not requiring additional training without being considered a co-employer. And I'm not 100% certain I understand that question.
I don't know what I do either, but I don't remember saying this earlier. So one of the things, so a lot of CMHs, I don't know why I keep saying CMS, I apologize. I have them on my brain, I guess. You know, a lot of CMHs, maybe through their PIHPs, have worked really hard to come up with this, wide set of training. And a lot of them feel like these are valuable trainings for people to have, and it helps make sure that people are healthy and safe and getting their needs met. So if the CMH is coming from an angle of there's a specific training that we really feel is beneficial and we really would like people to take it, no matter what kind of employee they are, then they absolutely can make that plea to that employer to say, like, this is an important training and we think you should offer it to your employees, and this is why. And if that employer wants to do that, that's absolutely fine. So it's not, there's a difference, right, between having that employer record have to have those employees trained in those extra trainings, and then voluntarily getting that training because they can see the value in it as well. So that's just the nuance in that. I don't know if that's answering that question or not, but if there are situations that there's just something that the CMH needs to train for whatever reason, just make sure that it's something that's an option instead of a requirement.
I don't see any other questions right now. If you do have a question that you'd like to ask, or if you don't want to ask it today, you are welcome to email it. We also do have the help desk, the self-determination help desk that Laura and I monitor and respond to. That is at the ARC Michigan's website. You're welcome to use for self-directed questions. But I don't see any other questions. Heather, do you have anything?
Nope, I just wanted to remind everyone that we do have 2 more sessions of this webinar next week. Tuesday, we will be talking about setting up arrangements, and then Thursday, we will be talking about arrangement oversight and responsibility. Right, so thank you, Laura and Marie, for presenting today, and we look forward to seeing you back next week.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming and all the good questions. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.